Wedge Issues is brought to you by wispolitics.com, a place where political insiders go for news, opinion, and campaign information. Once again, that's wispolitics.com.
It's been about a month since Josh Kaul was sworn in as Wisconsin's Attorney General, and there have been no shortage of issues for him to weigh in on. I'm Jessie Opoien, and this is Wedge Issues, a Cap Times podcast about state government and politics in Wisconsin. I sat down with Attorney General Kaul recently to talk about the first few weeks in office, a couple of legal challenges that have already come up for him to potentially weigh in on, and what he's going to be looking for in his budget request to Governor Tony Evers. Stay tuned to hear that conversation, but first let's check in with Eric Lawrenson and round up this week's news. Joining me once again, someone who sparks joy in the Marie Kondo philosophy on this podcast, Eric Lawrenson. Hi, Eric.
Hello. Thank you very much. That's very sweet of you. Yeah, I was just telling Jessie that I've been doing the whole Marie Kondo thing. I've finally caught the bug, as with anyone else who's been watching that Netflix show about, cleaning, organizing, tidying up your life. So yeah, I'm going through all my clothes, holding them in my hands, assessing where they're at on the Joy-O-meter, and then saying thank you and donating them or putting them back in the closet. Yeah, it's really fun, honestly. I'm having a grand old time doing it.
I am actively resisting it. I am a pack rat, and this will be a project for me at some point, but just really not there yet.
It's really cleansing, Jessie. I really strongly urge you to do it.
Cleansing. It's been a very cluttered week. I would like to take a look at the news cycle, actually, and figure out, does this story spark joy?
Let's take each one.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Let's move on. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I think people need to thank the news that they read each week more often. I think that would make the world a better place. Like you said, it's been quite a week, jam-packed with stories. Let's start with marijuana. Governor Tony. Let's start with marijuana, where many great conversations tend to start. Governor Tony Evers kind of has been tipping his hand lately when it comes to what he's thinking about putting into his proposed budget, and one of the things he revealed are some policy points regarding marijuana in the state of Wisconsin. He's talking about a couple of things here. He's talking about decriminalizing the sale and possession of very small amounts of marijuana. He is talking about legalizing medicinal marijuana. Yeah, Jessie, why don't you go a little bit more in depth here? What were some of the things that he's proposing with this plan?
So a significant component of this plan, as you mentioned, would be to allow the use of marijuana for medicinal purposes for particular ailments like cancer, glaucoma, chronic pain, post-traumatic stress disorder. There's a sort of an approved list of ailments and illnesses, but there are potentially others that would be up to the approval, I think, of the Department of Health Services. And this would be approved by a doctor, recommended by a doctor, and then you would have to go apply for a card, get an ID card, pay a fee for that. Dispensaries would be regulated by the state, and they would have to, also pay licensing fees. And there would be some revenue element to this, but then also some cost to enforcing it as well. We know that medical marijuana is something that Republicans and Democrats, to a degree, actually both support, and not every Republican does. I haven't encountered a whole lot of Democrats in the legislature who don't support it, but this is something where there's potential for bipartisan agreement. We know that Assembly Speaker Robin Vos supports medical marijuana. Senate Majority Leader Scott Fitzgerald does not. But the support there from legislative Republicans is sort of contingent on it being a very restricted, limited allowance for this. So something that would be small amounts, very specific cases that it would be allowed for, and something that would not easily be turned into recreational legalization.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like what legislative Republicans have been saying with Evers' plan specifically is they don't necessarily see that that happening. They don't see it passing.
That's right. And that's essentially because of the decriminalization element of it. Now, last session, there was actually a bipartisan bill that would have decriminalized possession of small amounts of marijuana. It didn't have a lot of co-sponsors, but it did have co-sponsors from both parties. That was possession of up to 10 grams of marijuana, and the amount that's being proposed in the Evers plan is up to 25 grams.
Yeah. As our good friend Molly Beck said in her coverage for the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, I love this for context. She noted that 25 grams of marijuana is just enough to fit into a Ziploc baggie for context.
That's helpful to know. That's helpful to know. I'm not good with math, so I need visual aids on these things. So that's where you start to see some issues with the legislation from Republicans. Evers, on the other hand, is saying, hey, I'd like to get to full recreational legalization at some point, but I'm just talking about this really small step. And he's presenting the decriminalization element of this as really a racial disparities issue, because studies have shown that African Americans tend to be arrested and charged with possession of marijuana at far higher rates, and especially in Wisconsin, than their white counterparts, despite using marijuana at essentially the same rate. So he's saying this is a way to start cracking down on racial disparities in incarceration, and he's also looking at introducing an expungement process for people who have already served their time for possession of that less than 25-gram amount.
And there seems to be, based on Marquette University polling, seems like generally there's some public support for the legalization of marijuana.
Yeah, and it's been growing over the years. They used to, they've asked this question a number of different ways, but most recently they asked just full legalization, what's the support for it? And it was 59% with a 35% opposition rate.
Hey, well, I think a great segue from this conversation about this marijuana proposal from Evers is to talk about another budgetary proposal that Governor Evers talked with you about, which has to do with women's health. Another budgetary plan that is sort of directly addressing some racial disparities in what we're seeing in the state. This time, maybe not so much with regards to incarceration, but with regard to health outcomes, infant mortality. This is a $28 million kind of packet of policy proposals. Tell us about it, Jessie.
Yeah, and I'd like to note, actually, while I was reporting on this, as I was learning about the racial disparities in infant mortality rates, I found some really great coverage on that issue from our own colleague, Lisa Speckard-Pass.
Lisa wrote a great cover story about infant mortality in Dane County and about those racial disparities, yeah.
Yeah, and it's really staggering statistics, and so this proposal is looking at reducing infant mortality rates all the way around, but particularly trying to get at some of the racial disparities there. So Governor Evers is calling this the Healthy Women, Healthy Babies plan, and it does a lot of things. I think one of the most expensive part of it, the most significant component, is expanding the amount of time that a woman who's covered by Medicaid can receive postpartum coverage. So currently that is a 60-day window after a woman gives birth, and this plan would extend that to a full year after giving birth. The plan would also create an infant mortality prevention program in the Department of Health Services. It would fund a number of grants that do things all the way from, offering preventative screenings, mammograms, STI testing, to getting into communities where there are high-risk births happening, and focusing on the support systems that can be put in place to try to keep young babies healthy and keep their families healthy. And then the more controversial element of this proposal is that it would make Planned Parenthood once again eligible for some federal funding streams that it had previously been eligible for, but those were taken away under Governor Scott Walker. So this proposal has gotten a lot of really positive reaction from Democratic lawmakers, from women's health providers, and it's gotten some initial skepticism from Republicans. In the initial hours after it being released, talking to Republicans, none of them had read it yet, but immediately the thing that caught their attention was making Planned Parenthood eligible for those funds again. Assembly Speaker Robin Vos said, hadn't read the proposal yet, but he would pretty unequivocally state that Republicans would not give another nickel more than Planned Parenthood is currently getting. And so that could be an area where that proposal gets hung up. Yeah, a lot of the other components of this proposal are just adding more funding to programs that already exist. So these are things that the state is already supporting and in theory wouldn't be controversial. It's just a question of prioritizing those funds.
Gotcha. Well, finally, moving right along, let's talk about something that we actually went fairly in-depth into last week when we talked about this Republican tax plan that got approved by both the Assembly and the Senate, ended up on Governor Tony Evers' desk. And, there was some indication last week that Governor Evers was not a fan of this plan, and this week he vetoed it, kind of in alignment with what he was saying last week. He was not a fan of the way that Republicans ended up sort of accounting for where this tax cut came from. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what exactly his beef with this plan was and why he ultimately vetoed it?
What's his beef?
This would be a recurring segment. What's that beef?
Oh, God, we'd have so much material. This was not a surprise to anyone that Governor Evers was not a fan of the Republican version of this tax plan, as we've talked about before. Governor Evers campaigned on cutting taxes by 10% for the middle class, but he wanted to fund that in part by tapping into budget reserves, but also in part by scaling back a tax credit for manufacturers. Republicans view that scaling back as a tax hike on manufacturers. They said, we've got a pretty good budget situation right now. We should tap into those reserves. Tony Evers said that's not sustainable because there's no guarantee that those reserves will be in the same condition that they are in right now. Republicans say there's never any guarantee, and your plan also taps into the reserves, and so on and so forth. But in addition to that, the governor said that he believes that this process should be conducted during the actual budget session, which is about to start. He's going to introduce his own budget proposal next week. So, he argued that this is a conversation that should be taking place within the context of the larger spending plan as a whole.
Gotcha. So it based on that, it sounds very potentially likely that we're going to be having this conversation once again, just in a matter of weeks, but just in the context of a budgetary proposal.
I would bet on it.
All right. All right. And Jessie, just very briefly, we want to acknowledge that Governor Tony Evers also weighed in on ongoing litigation with regard to the controversial lame duck session of 2018, in which Republicans passed a number of bills that sort of, broadly speaking, curtailed certain powers with the office of the governorship. What did he say?
He said that these bills make him unable to effectively do his job, and that leaving them in place would do irreparable harm to the executive branch and to the Attorney General's position as well. So he is supporting those who are challenging the laws. And the lawsuits keep on piling up. I think we're at 4 right now, most recently with the Democratic Party of Wisconsin announcing that they will also be challenging it. So this is going to be an ongoing discussion in the weeks and months to come of the legality of these laws, and probably there will be rulings and appeals, and it could go on for quite a while.
Gotcha. Well, listeners, I hope that you held each one of those news items in your hands and really contemplated it and thanked it, cherished it, and hopefully you didn't throw it away.
Hopefully they sparked some joy for you, or some sort of feeling. Or not.
Or not, just live your life. Live your life. We don't all have to ascribe to a condo philosophy here. I know she's the hot thing, but, she's not for everyone.
No. Probably not for me.
Fair enough. All right. Well, thanks as always for having me, Jessie.
So I'd like to start with the speech you gave at your inauguration ceremony when you talked about the lame duck legislation that was passed by Republicans that rolled back some of the powers of some of the powers of the governor. You were the most forceful of anyone who spoke that day to speak against that. Why did you feel that was the right time to talk about that and to talk about that in the way that you did?
Yeah, I think it was important to talk about because it's a fundamental principle of our system of government that we don't switch the authority that elected offices have between the time of an election and the time when people take office. And so I thought it was important to talk about that and talk about how we need to make sure that our fundamental principles are taking precedence over the debates we're having, that the debates at the moment. And also, I wanted to make clear that I also think we need to be working together. There are a lot of issues that I expect to be able to work together with people on both sides of the aisle on public safety issues, for example. And I think it's important that we approach issues with the goal of working together and getting things accomplished. And so I wanted to emphasize that because I do believe that we can get important legislation enacted with broad support. In terms of the effects, I think some of them are pretty clear. One is to withdraw from a lawsuit. DOJ, in certain circumstances, needs to get approval now from the Joint Finance Committee rather than the governor. A second area is if DOJ is, the statute says, prosecuting a civil action. So, for example, if there's a breach of a contract action and DOJ is enforcing it, to settle that action, DOJ needs to get approval from the Joint Finance Committee again. And so the result is going to be a slower process, a process that's less efficient, and it's the authority has been given to the Joint Finance Committee. The other thing is there are impacts on DOJ from a budget standpoint. So one obvious example is that the Solicitor General's office was eliminated. That's 4 attorneys right there who were eliminated from DOJ. So there have been meaningful changes that have resulted from that legislation, but the Department of Justice will continue doing the critical work that it's doing to make communities stronger.
Potentially one of the more confusing things to come from the lame duck legislation is figuring out how to navigate the state's participation in a lawsuit that's seeking to challenge the Affordable Care Act, which you are now not allowed to withdraw from without the legislature's approval. Can you just give us an update on where things are with that and how the lame duck law changed your power there?
Yeah, so I don't have any updates. I think it was last week, Representative Nygren commented on the status of things. I believe he said that he hadn't talked to the full caucus yet. But in terms of the way the process works now, previously, if the Department of Justice wanted to withdraw from a lawsuit such as the ACA case, it would have needed approval from the governor's office. And once it had that, it could have withdrawn from the suit. Now the process has changed. Basically, that authority has been moved from the governor to the Joint Finance Committee. So under current statute, for the state of Wisconsin to withdraw from a civil action, it needs to get approval from the Joint Finance Committee to do so.
Is there a scenario in which if the Joint Finance Committee did not grant you approval, you would look for a creative way to get around that, changing the state's position within the lawsuit or just pulling resources from the lawsuit in the first place?
So once Wisconsin is in a lawsuit, if the Department of Justice is representing the state of Wisconsin, my view is that you litigate that case appropriately, regardless of whether I were to personally agree with the way the Joint Finance were to resolve something. A similar example is if DOJ is defending a statute, if the department is involved in defending it, whether or not I personally agree with it, you approach the case where you represent the state appropriately and make the arguments you need to make on behalf of the state. I think that it's appropriate for the department to consider the bigger picture, the broader implications of some arguments. So if they might help in defense of one statute, but for example, they would undermine our ability to defend other state statutes, I certainly think that's appropriate to consider. But generally speaking, the role of the department is to litigate the cases fully.
So you'll also be defending the state in challenges to its redistricting maps?
Yes. Yeah. So that's I believe that Wisconsin should have nonpartisan redistricting. I would like to see legislation enacted that would set up a model that's similar to the model that Iowa has, because I think that that's in the interest of voters in Wisconsin, and I think it will save us money down the road in litigation costs. But that's not the current law in Wisconsin. There's a pending suit, and I think that there's legally defensible basis for defending the current maps, and so the Department of Justice will continue defending them.
Another potentially high-profile lawsuit, Planned Parenthood has challenged a number of laws limiting access to abortion in Wisconsin. Some anti-abortion groups like Wisconsin Right to Life have expressed concerns that you would not be able to appropriately defend the state in those cases since Planned Parenthood endorsed you in your election. Can you speak to that case?
Yeah, those cases are being reviewed right now, and the approach that we will take in that case is the same one we would take in cases generally, which is if there's a reasonable legal defense basis for defending those statutes, we will, and I think we'll be making clear what approach we'll be taking in the, I'm not sure exactly when, but in the weeks ahead.
Wedge Issues is sponsored by WisPolitics.com. You can become a WisPolitics.com member. Find out more at WisPolitics.com/membership.
Jumping back to your inauguration speech, the one piece of policy that you talked about in that speech is red flag laws, something that you're asking the legislature to support. Have you had any conversations with lawmakers about what you'd like that to look like and what your role as Attorney General might be in that?
So I know that there have been some proposals in the legislature in previous sessions about red flag legislation. And, I'm certainly happy to weigh in on details as legislature makes progress. But I think the critical components are, first of all, that there be a process in place so that if somebody clearly is posing a threat to the safety of others, so somebody who's posted some sort of threat, for example, online, or there's significant reason to believe that the person may be a threat to themselves, there's a significant concern of suicide, that there's a process in place that allows law enforcement or a family member to go to a judge to get an order that temporarily disarms that person. I think that we need to make sure that there are appropriate safeguards in the legislation, and I think it's something that should be used fairly rarely. But I think having that sort of process in place is important, and so I'm hopeful that we will be able to work with members of the legislature to get something enacted.
As the legislature looks for ways to work across the aisle, combating opioid abuse has always been an area where they've been able to do that. Also something that you talked about a lot on the campaign trail. Where is your office right now in terms of looking at things your predecessor did, finding things that you want to expand, do differently?
So one thing I think I hope to continue at least, but actually even better expand upon is grants for TAD programs, treatment and diversion programs. I think part of what we need to do to address the opioid epidemic and the growing problem with meth in Wisconsin is to make sure that people who do need assistance with substance abuse addiction are able to get the help that they need. And I think if we have our criminal justice system set up in a way so that people who end up in the system because of an addiction or because of a mental health issue, if they're able to get the treatment they need rather than just ending up in jail, I think we are going to better be able to address the underlying issue and hopefully make it less likely that person is going to end up in the system again. I also think it's critical that our enforcement efforts target large-scale traffickers of drugs. Actually, just this morning we were announcing some grant funding that was awarded. This is pursuant to legislation that was authored by Representative Nygren and Senator Leo Vukmir in the last legislative session that authorized $1 million worth of grants for law enforcement agencies working on drug trafficking. And the funds are going to go to things like the purchase of undercover vehicles, surveillance equipment, money for undercover drug buys, and then also safety equipment. But ensuring that law enforcement has the resources it needs around the state, not just to do, to make a single arrest here or there, but rather to do longer-term intensive investigations where cases can be worked up the chain of supply, where law enforcement is working together at the local level, county level, state level, federal level, so that investigations are resulting in charges and prosecutions of conspiracies or trafficking networks. I believe that that's the most effective way to make sure that enforcement efforts are making a difference. So continuing to work on those efforts is going to be an important part of what DOJ is doing.
Governor Evers will be introducing his budget proposal soon. What are you looking to see in that for the Department of Justice?
Yeah, so there are a few priorities that we have for the Department of Justice. One is, and the sort of overall thing I think is we want to make sure that we are modernizing DOJ's ability to respond to public safety issues and making sure that the tools we have to respond reflect modern challenges to public safety. So one area where I think we clearly need more resources is the state crime labs. As one example, there's been an increase from 2015 with respect to average turnaround times for DNA analysis. So we're going to be requesting more resources for the state crime labs. Another important thing that DOJ does is assists law enforcement agencies around the state. And I'll give you an example that relates to our budget request. One of the things we're asking for is additional examiners for the digital forensics unit. The folks in that unit recover evidence from cell phones, from computers, and as you know, that technology is ubiquitous these days. So making sure that there are sufficient resources, a sufficient number of people to recover that evidence, I think is important. But it helps local law enforcement because most agencies in the state don't have digital forensic examiners, and that's a service that DOJ can provide to agencies across the state and help them with their investigations in these important cases. And then another thing I think we should be doing to modernize is, as we were just talking about, increasing the use of treatment and diversion programs so that where people need substance abuse treatment, they need mental health treatment, they're able to get the treatment they need, and that law enforcement's investigative and prosecutorial resources are able to focus on the more serious offenders, whether it's larger scale drug traffickers or gang members, with those resources. I'd also like to see more grant funding made available for innovative community policing programs. I think that when law enforcement officers know people in the communities where they're working and vice versa, first of all, I think just improving those relationships is important, but I also think you get better outcomes when you have those relationships. From a law enforcement standpoint, I believe that you get better intelligence if you have those relationships, and that means a better ability to work on some of those investigations that do target larger scale folks. You find out more information about who may be somebody involved in serious crime if you have those relationships.
Will you be looking for more funding for DA's offices?
Yes. So I support increasing funding for DAs. And, I think public radio maybe reported on a coalition that has come together. DOJ is part of that, but also state public defenders, the state courts, and then I believe it's both assistant DAs and the Wisconsin DAs Association. But one of the important requests in that is that there be additional funding for ADAs. And it's really important that we have a sufficient number of DAs, assistant DAs. For one thing, it's important that cases be prosecuted in a timely fashion, that they not be delayed because there's a shortage of prosecutors. That's important to public safety. It's important for victims of crime. And it's also important for the system to work effectively. For example, with treatment and diversion programs, if prosecutors are so under-resourced that they're not able to review cases until they're showing up in court, it's much harder to make an appropriate decision about whether somebody should be moved into a diversion program or instead should be going through the regular court process. If somebody who's a defendant in a case, what they really need is treatment, having them wait extra months before the case moves forward doesn't help on that front either. So increasing ADAs around the state is an important step that I'm hopeful that the legislature will take in this session.
Will the public defender element be part of that too?
That's part of the request from the coalition, is that reimbursement rates be increased when they're defense lawyers who are appointed by the public defender. And part of the logic behind that coalition proposal is when any part of the system is not funded appropriately, it has impacts on the system as a whole. So with public defender pay, for example, when it takes a long time to get an attorney appointed for a defendant in a criminal case, that slows down the prosecution. All these delays we're talking about with potential shortages of ADAs. Likewise, when the case is delayed because there's no lawyer to appoint, you have these same problems happen.
Heading into the next year, what would you say the biggest challenges and priorities are, aside from what we've talked about in terms of public safety or consumer protection for your office?
Yeah, our top priority is public safety, and I touched on some of the elements that we hope will be included in the governor's request to the legislature. But as we talked about before, making sure we are doing what we can to address the opioid epidemic and our growing meth problem is a major priority. I think We need to do more on school safety. We talked about a potential red flag law. I would certainly like to see universal background checks as well, and long-term funding for mental health programs in schools. Another issue that we are working on addressing is we're hoping to ultimately propose draft legislation that would reduce the likelihood of there ever being another backlog of untested rape kits in Wisconsin. We've begun the process of preparing draft legislation and hope to have something in the next few months that hopefully will get broad support and that the legislature will adopt. So those are all important public safety issues. Another one is working to combat human trafficking in Wisconsin. And there are important things we can be doing on that front. One is making sure that the public is aware of the danger posed by human trafficking and is aware of the signs of human trafficking so that people can report to law enforcement if they see those signs. But then also, again, making sure we've got enforcement efforts that are targeting the traffickers is an important part of what we need to do. So those are all important public safety priorities, among others. But also getting back to being effective in enforcing our consumer protection laws and our environmental laws is a priority of mine. And partly that is a matter of making sure that it's clear to attorneys within the department that is a priority again, and allowing assistant AGs to do their job of enforcing those laws. And since my heart still likes to beat, I'm coming home. Come home with me. Oh, Wisconsin. Oh, Wisconsin. Oh, Wisconsin. Feeling bad since 1948. Thank you for listening to Wedge Issues. Our theme music is Oh Wisconsin by Loxley. We'll be back every Friday with new episodes, so make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss anything. If you have feedback or suggestions, you can find me on Twitter at Jessie Opoien, or you can email me at jopoien@madison.com. If you like Wedge Issues, you can check out our other Cap Times podcasts like The Madsplainers and The Corner Table. Next week, we'll be talking about the state budget. We'll see you then.
Wedge Issues has been brought to you by wispolitics.com. There are plenty of benefits to becoming a member. You can go to wispolitics.com/membership to find out more.